Before I turn the program to Shona, I just wanted to share this quote from her book that I just think is a beautiful segue into her sharing her story. This is from American historian Edward Rowe Snow, who said, "To almost every man and woman, there is something about a lighted beacon which suggests hope and trust and appeals to the better instincts of all mankind." So, with that lovely transition, I now am pleased and thrilled to introduce and give the floor to Shona Riddell.
Thank you, Julie, for that lovely introduction. And thank you so much to the American Mariners Museum for having me as a guest today. So today I'm going to talk about the extraordinary lives of lighthouse women through the centuries. And I call them extraordinary because not only did they often live in very remote locations, they also performed very difficult work and often quite dangerous work as well, which we will see in a moment when I share my lecture. So as Julie mentioned, this particular lighthouse on the cover, if you're from Virginia, you will recognize that it's called New Point Comfort Lighthouse. And I'll share more information about this lighthouse later on, but I'll just mention here that the tower was built over 200 years ago in 1805, and it's about 60 feet high. And I believe it's the 10th oldest lighthouse in the United States. And it's so strong that it withstood a hurricane that separated these rocks from the mainland in the early 1930s, which is really gives testament to how powerful these structures are. So in tonight's presentation, I'm going to briefly talk about the evolution of lighthouses and how they came to be, because if we didn't have lighthouses, of course, we wouldn't have had keepers, and it provides a bit of context. And then I'll talk about how women came to be principal or head lighthouse keepers, especially in the US, because there were quite a few women in charge of lighthouses during the 1800s, which is pretty remarkable for the time. And then I'm going to share some stories of particular heroic lighthouse women who were daring and courageous, and some are remembered and some are not so remembered for different reasons, but I'll tell you their stories in a moment. And then we'll move on to today's keepers and caretakers, because even in the 21st century, even though most lighthouses are automated, they're still cared for by caretakers, and some parts of the world still have staffed lighthouses, which I was really excited to discover when I was writing my book. And then finally, at the end, I believe we'll have time for your questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Right, so we're going to begin a very long time ago in ancient times, because women have been minding the lights in some capacity since ancient Rome. And here I'm referring to the Vestal Virgins who guarded the, I'll move my cursor here, they guarded what was known as the eternal flame in Rome, and that was their job. And also there was Hestia, who was the Greek goddess of the hearth. So women weren't typically sailors at that time, but there were stories about women or female creatures such as mermaids and sirens who were blamed for distracting sailors and causing shipwrecks. And it was also traditionally considered bad luck to have women on board ships, because they were considered not only to distract sailors, but also to anger the gods, who would then whip up storms and cause trouble. But having said that, ships often did have female figureheads carved into them to represent women, and they were often given women's names. And that was a way of connecting the ship to women who were waiting at home. And as we know, ships have been at sea for thousands of years. And as long as these ships have been at sea dealing with stormy, tumultuous weather, there has been a need for guiding lights to bring them back home, draw them into the harbour and keep them safe. But of course, thousands of years ago, those lights were a lot more rudimentary than they are today. And one example can be found in Homer's book, or Homer's poem, the Iliad, which was from about 750 BC. And the lines are, "As to seamen o'er the wave is born, the watchfire's light, which high among the hills, some shepherd kindles in his lonely fold." And so there it gives you the image of the watchfire, or what would have been a bonfire lit on a hill. And that was the earliest form of a lighthouse or a beacon to bring these ships safely into the harbour. And of course, it was a long journey to evolve these lighthouses from the hilltop fires as they were in 750 BC to the much more sturdy structures we know today. And this image you can see on the right is Largemouth Lighthouse in France, in Brittany. And as you can see, it was built to last. So this photo was taken from a helicopter in the late 1980s. There were still resident keepers at that time, so they're obviously inside the tower. But you can see just the sheer force of nature that these towers can withstand, which is incredible. And it just is testimony to the engineering and the strength of these towers, that they're still standing today. And of course, earlier iterations of these towers, which were made of wood, were not as successful. You know, they were not strong enough to deal with hurricanes and such storms as we still see. And of course, it wasn't enough just for the tower itself to be strong. Its light also had to be as powerful as possible to guide the ships, so the ships could see the lighthouse. And over the centuries, this also evolved. So as I mentioned, the early bonfires had wood to fuel them. And then there were candles, which wouldn't have been particularly effective. And then coal, but of course coal came with its own problems because it was smoky, it would smoke the windows, and it was heavy to carry. And so from the late 1700s, there was the Argon Lamp, which you can see top right here. And that was a big development because it involved pouring oil and wicks to keep the light burning. And so when you hear lighthouse keepers referred to as wickies, or pouring the oil, or trimming the wicks, this is what they were doing. And that involved trimming the wicks and pouring the oil often several times a night to keep the light burning strongly. And then in the early 1800s, the Fresnel lens was developed, and that's the large orb you can see top left here. And that was huge as well because it involved hundreds of refracting prisms, which not only caused a bright light, but directed it in a tight beam up to 20 miles out to sea. So that was hugely beneficial for lighthouses. And of course, you can see here, the bottom image, Portland Head Lighthouse, the foggy conditions that can affect a lot of coastlines. And so this tight beam out to sea was much needed. And lighthouses such as this also had fog signals and poor visibility. And over the centuries, that also evolved from firing rifles, whistles, horns, cannons, trumpets. You can just imagine the noise they would have caused. And then eventually there were automated signals, but of course today ships have GPS, which makes them less crucial. Now with this evolution and development of lighthouses, of course it was mostly men involved. It was the men building the lighthouses and designing the lighthouses and running the lighthouses, but there were women involved from time to time as well. And one example was Queen Elizabeth I in England, who in 1566 established what was called the Sea Marks Act. And she called for beacons, marks, and signs for the sea, whereby the dangers may be avoided and escaped, and ships the better come into their ports without peril. So this was a huge act to introduce. And of course, she's talking about lighthouses, but the word lighthouse hadn't quite been introduced into the English language yet. So they were beacons. And a few hundred years later in America, there was a man called Stephen Pleasanton, who was in charge of lighthouses in the early days for over 3 decades, from 1820 to 1852. And he looks slightly grim in this portrait, but he's remembered as being well-intentioned and a kind man. And one of the policies he introduced was the employment of women as head lighthouse keepers. And his reasoning for that was simply because if the male keeper passed away, then the widow was already living there. She'd probably been doing the job anyway. She needed the work to continue to support herself and the children because there was no pension then. And so in writing, he wrote, "I have recommended on the death of a keeper that his widow, if steady and respectable, should be appointed to succeed him." And so this resulted in more than 120 women in America alone being appointed principal or head keepers, meaning they were in charge of the lighthouse. And many of them served on average longer than 10 years, which is remarkable. So it was a long-term profession. And these statistics come from a really wonderful book called Women Who Kept the Lights, which is a history of lighthouse women in America. And many of these women who were employed were widows, as I mentioned, but interestingly, not all of them were, which I'll explain shortly. So it was clear from Stephen Pleasanton's introduction that it was more convenience that spurred on this policy rather than, trying to empower women or create opportunities and career as we might imagine it now. But it was certainly a successful policy. So many of us, when we picture a lighthouse keeper, we might imagine, an old sailor chomping on a pipe and looking out to sea. And certainly there were such lighthouse keepers, but also we don't always know what they did in terms of, what was a typical day like for a lighthouse keeper. And they had a huge amount of work to do. It wasn't just keeping the light burning. Crucially, lighthouse keepers worked day and night, pre-electricity, when lighthouses couldn't just be switched on and off. So they're working day and night in all weather conditions, often remote and dangerous circumstances, because the worse the weather, the more important their job was. So it's really risky. And as I mentioned, they had to keep the lamps lit, such as pouring oil and trimming wicks. They also had to wind the rotating lens, which is what gave the lighthouse its flashing effect. They did a huge amount of cleaning and polishing, because if the glass panes were dirty, then the light wasn't as visible out to sea. They sounded the fog alarm if they lived in a fog-prone area. From the mid-1800s, there was a huge amount of paperwork to do with reports and administration and keepers' logs. They had to signal ships out to sea. This was pre-radio, so they used semaphore or flag signals. They had to host any visitors who visited the lighthouse station. If the station had soil around it, they had a farm and gardened, and obviously vegetables were important for a healthy diet. They monitored the local wildlife, especially if there were rare birds or vulnerable species around them. And of course, many of them had families, so they were raising children at the same time. And crucially, it was part of a lighthouse keeper's job description to perform search and rescue. So if they looked out to sea and saw a ship or a boat in trouble, they were expected to, as far as possible, go out and rescue those people in trouble. So it was really risky work. And something that fascinated me when I was doing my research was that these female keepers in the 1800s received exactly the same pay as the male keepers did, and they often had male assistants. So a lot of these remote lighthouses would have supply boats that would come and deliver provisions and fuel for the light and so on, but they were not always to be depended on, because if the weather hampered their arrival, sometimes they didn't come for months. So these keepers had to be really self-sufficient in all situations. And crucially, as I mentioned, keepers were expected to fill in daily logs recording the weather and anything else important that day. And that gives us a glimpse into their lives. And particularly for the women, it gives us a record in their own voice of what they were doing, which we wouldn't otherwise have. So as I mentioned, many of these lighthouses were very isolated outposts, which would have been challenging. And in the early days, they had to deal with broken sleep, often tumultuous weather. Early keepers in particular, before there were family stations, were really mostly by themselves. So isolation would have been hard. The more remote the location, obviously, the more isolated they were. If there were women at the station, they had to deal with pregnancy and giving birth at the lighthouse. And many of these lighthouses from the mid-1800s were given medical kits, and that included instruction manuals and sort of supplies for accidents and emergencies. So that included bandages and ointments and medicines, and you can use your imagination for how a 1800s lighthouse medical kit would look, but it really indicated that keepers had to be able to handle any situation. And of course, there were children at these stations sometimes too. And one example was at Boone Island Light in Maine. A girl called Annie Bell Hobbs wrote an article for a children's magazine when she was 14 in 1870, and really gave an indication as to how hard the life was, and said, "I'm shut out from the world." So, it wasn't an easy life for many people. But having said that, it wasn't all gloom and doom. Many lighthouses were family stations where everybody chipped in and shared the chores, and there was a daily routine. And another thing that I loved while I was doing my research was the fact that American lighthouses had a library system from the 1800s where a box of about 40 books would be delivered, and then 3 or 4 months later it was rotated to the next lighthouse. And that box would include a Bible and fiction and history books and science. So there was something for everybody, but I can imagine as a book lover just how exciting that delivery would have been. And the other American tradition that I really loved learning about was flying Santa. And from the early 1900s, there was a Santa Claus that would fly over some of the more isolated lighthouses and drop packages filled with Christmas gifts for the lighthouse families. And I believe that tradition is still running even now, which is lovely. Now, moving on to stories of particular lighthouse women, and many of you will be familiar with the story of Ida Lewis, who is considered one of America's most famous lighthouse keepers. Now, Ida lived on Lime Rock in Rhode Island, and she moved there as a teenager when she was 15. Her father, Hosea, was employed as the lighthouse keeper, but sadly, just a few months later, he suffered a debilitating stroke and he couldn't run the lighthouse anymore. So, as was often the case, Ida's mother took over the job and Ida helped. So Ida was performing those lighthouse duties from very early on in her life. And not only that, she was rowing her siblings to school each day, which came in handy, her skill with the rowboat, because very quickly she was also performing rescues. And I believe her first rescue was at the age of 16, and through her life, well into her 60s, she was still rescuing people and saving lives. It wasn't until 1869 that her story really became known, because it was picked up by the local newspaper, and then that circulated more widely across America. And suddenly she was famous. And in those days, fame meant that she was sent gifts and she was offered marriage proposals. Many portraits were painted of her, and tourists would come to the lighthouse just to see her. And so in one summer alone, I believe there were more than 5,000 tourists to the lighthouse, just curious people wanting to meet her and see her and visit the lighthouse. And as part of a lighthouse keeper's duties, she was expected to, welcome them and give them a tour. So that would have been quite tiring. She was eventually appointed head keeper of Lime Rock in 1879, and that was after the death of her father and mother. And she was paid $750 per annum, which at the time made her the highest paid lighthouse keeper, male or female, in the whole of the United States, which was pretty remarkable. And part of the reason for that was in recognition of her many rescues that she had performed. So in addition to that, she was awarded medals for the bravery. And after her death, Lime Rock was renamed Ida Lewis Lighthouse, which was a very rare tribute as a way to honor her and the work that she performed. And here's a portrait of Ida Lewis from 1869 in Harper's Weekly. So this was around the time that her fame emerged. And there was a little bit of uneasiness as to whether it was feminine to row out and fish men out of the water who were in trouble. And Ida's response to that was, there is nothing unfeminine about saving people's lives. And another quote from her was, I never thought of danger when people needed help. At such times, you're busy thinking of other things. So she was always remembered as being very modest and pragmatic and really just getting on with her job, which she loved, and she performed for decades. And to learn more about Ida Lewis's life, there's a really great biography of her called The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, which I recommend. Another female lighthouse keeper from a similar time was Kathleen or Kate Moore, who was the keeper at Black Rock Harbour Light in Connecticut. And she had similarities to Ida in that she had lived at the lighthouse with her father for a long time, and her father was unwell, so Kate had performed many of the duties for almost 50 years. And finally, she was appointed keeper in the early 1870s. And she's also remembered for saving at least 20 lives, but her fame, she was never famous the way Ida was. She's also remembered for carving wooden ducks and selling them as souvenirs, and farming oysters, because lighthouse keepers were allowed to come up with creative ways to top up their income as long as it didn't interfere with their lighthouse duties. And she's also remembered for chasing away oyster poachers with a rifle. So clearly quite a strong character. And I just love this photo of her, obviously taken late in her life. You can really see the years of hard work and experience on her face. Kate Walker's story is a little bit different because unlike Ida Lewis, she didn't grow up in a lighthouse. She married a lighthouse keeper. And what that meant was she had to adjust to this completely different way of life. So when she and her husband and kids moved to Robbins Reef Light, which is here in New York, it came as quite a shock to Kate. She was pregnant with her second child, and she apparently threatened to leave and refused to unpack her suitcase because just the sight of the water all around the lighthouse made her feel lonesome. But eventually she did come to love it. But sadly, her husband, John, passed away of pneumonia not long after they arrived. And some of his final words to her were, "Mind the light, Kate." And she did. She was given the job, and she ran this lighthouse for over 30 years while raising her 2 children. And as you can see, the lighthouse is surrounded by the sea, and in the winter was often covered in ice, and she had to clean off the ice. She was only 4'10" and 100 pounds. So initially there were doubts as to whether she could perform the job, but she proved daily that she was more than capable, and she rescued dozens of people in her time there as well. And as I mentioned, these keepers' logs give us access to some of these women's experiences. So at the top here is an entry from Kate Walker, giving an example of a fairly perilous time outdoors, trying to clean the ice. And she says, "The wind nearly whirled me off the landing while the sleet covered my hair like a hood. Finally, I had to sink to my knees and work my way to the door." So it wasn't an easy life, but she did come to love it. And then when she passed away in 1931, the New York Evening Post wrote an obituary and gave tribute to her. And they wrote, "In sight of the city of towers and the torch of liberty lived this sturdy little woman, proud of her work and content in it, keeping her lamp alight and windows clean so that New York Harbor might be safe for ships that pass in the night." So it's a lovely tribute to her. And now we're moving to Harriet Colfax, who was another female keeper, and she was in charge of Michigan City Light in Indiana for a long time. And this was her lighthouse, which is now a museum. Yeah, this is Harriet. Her story is quite unusual in that she wasn't a keeper's widow or daughter. So she hadn't grown up in lighthouses and she didn't marry a keeper. What happened was she initially worked with her brother, Richard, who was a newspaper editor. But when Richard became unwell, the newspaper had to fold and Harriet needed a job. And in those days, keepers were federal employees appointed by the US government. And she had a cousin named Schuyler Colfax, who was a congressman at the time. Later, he'd go on to be a vice president. And so he was able to use his connections to get her appointed as keeper of Michigan City Light in 1861 when she was 37. And then she went on to mine this lighthouse for 43 years, which is remarkable. And I've written lights plural because she not only minded the light in the house that you saw in the previous slide, but there was another light at the end of a long pier that she was also expected to light at night. And it was a little bit tricky because the pier was often slippery with ice in the winter or overcome by tall waves and strong winds. And so again, we have another example from Harriet's logs. This one's from 1873, where she wrote, "A terrible hurricane tonight at about the time of lighting up. Narrowly escaped being swept into the lake." So again, it wasn't an easy job. She had to light the lamps at sunset and then trim the wicks and polish the glass to keep it clear at midnight, and then extinguish the lamps at dawn. And she did that every day, every week, every month for over 40 years. And she never married or had children, but she did have a companion, a teacher named Anne Hartwell, who lived with her at the lighthouse for almost 40 years. But Harriet always insisted on lighting the lamps herself. She took her job very seriously. And so then in 1904, at the grand age of 80, she became America's oldest and also longest serving lighthouse keeper. And a newspaper called the Chicago Tribune wrote about her, and the title of the article was, "A fragile woman of 80 years is Uncle Sam's oldest and most reliable lighthouse keeper." And they wrote, "There were times when she was ill. There were nights when the groaning, wind-driven seas lashed over the long pier that led to the harbour beacon. Drenched with icy spray, groping her way to the beacon, floundering, tired, chilled, but she never failed to keep the beacon bright and constant, never permitted the fears of her womanly heart to deter her for a moment." And on the left is a photo of Michigan City Light as it looks today, very different from how it would have looked in Harriet's time. Now, we've mentioned some keepers who were named and paid and employed, but it's also really important to mention that not all keepers were given that honour. They were not always acknowledged for their work. And so one example comes from New Point Comfort Light in Virginia, which is the lighthouse on my book cover and the one I mentioned at the beginning. And so there was a woman working as a keeper's assistant there in 1852. And a lighthouse inspector visited and wrote that the light was manned by a retired sea captain who would have been Isaac Foster at that time, and his assistant, a female slave. So even though she was working there, we do not know her name. But having said that, there were African-American headkeepers who were employed in the 1800s, including at New Point Comfort Light. And one example was J. McHenry Farley, who was a preacher, and he was a keeper there from 1871 to 3. And so these photos you can see here, the New Point Comfort Lighthouse on the left, I'm not sure the exact year of the photo, but I'm guessing late 1800s, used to be connected to the mainland and used to have these keepers' dwellings. And on the right is how it looks today. So obviously the landscape has changed considerably, but the tower itself is still standing. And now I'm going to bring you across the world to my country, New Zealand, and tell you the story of Mary Jane Bennett, who lived at Pancarro Lighthouse in Wellington. So to give you a bit of context, if you can see my cursor, I don't know if you can, but I'm talking to you from across the harbour from this lighthouse over in this area here. That's where I am. And Pancarro Lighthouse is special because it was New Zealand's first permanent lighthouse and also the home of our first and only female lighthouse keeper. And Mary Jane's story was quite remarkable. She grew up in Yorkshire, England, and she had a very comfortable upbringing. She was a squire's daughter. And then one day in her 20s, she met a man called George Bennett, who was a seedsman. And Mary's father did not approve of the match. So Mary Jane and George sailed separately for New Zealand and got married over here in the early 1850s. And George was appointed lighthouse keeper, but the first lighthouse is the building you can see here in the image. It was really just a tiny shack made of wood and with a lantern in the window. So it was not a very effective light, and it was also not a very comfortable home for them. And George wrote letters complaining of leaking and cold because on the peninsula there, conditions and a cold wind and heavy rain would have been very difficult indeed. And sadly, their 2-year-old daughter Eliza died at around this time, possibly related to the conditions at the house. So as I mentioned, George was the lighthouse keeper. He was also our very first lighthouse keeper. And sadly, he drowned just a few years later in the harbour in 1855 when he was returning to the lighthouse with supplies. And that meant Mary Jane was left at the lighthouse with 5 young children and also 3 months pregnant. She took over the lighthouse keeping job, becoming our first and only keeper, female keeper. So this is the lighthouse as it looks today, and it was first lit in 1859. And there was quite a big celebration because Wellington had been asking for a more solid lighthouse for quite a long time. There had been quite a few shipwrecks in the area. And so there was a big celebration on the day and newspaper coverage. But interestingly, Mary Jane, even though she was the keeper, is not mentioned at all. But happily, the Bennett family were given better lodging, so they were more comfortable. And Mary was given a male assistant called William Lyle. And he did not really enjoy working with a woman. He wrote letters of complaint, but his letters were ignored, and Mary Jane was commended for her hard work. And she performed this job at this rather isolated lighthouse for 10 years. And after that, she returned to England and took her 6 children. Now, sadly, there's no surviving image of Mary Jane Bennett, but here you can see her 6 children. And the small boy in the front is William. So he was the baby she was pregnant with when her husband died. And William is also my great uncle, which was something I didn't realize until I started writing my book. So it was great to have that connection for me. And William and his brothers actually returned to New Zealand from England when they were adults. And William took on the job as keeper at Pancarro Lighthouse, so the same lighthouse in the 1880s. And Mary Jane died in England in the 1880s as well, in her 60s. And her relatives have been told that she was the widow of a wealthy sheep farmer because it was not considered a respectable job to be a lighthouse keeper. However, her descendants have all remembered and cherished the story. And so on special anniversaries of this lighthouse, descendants make a journey to Pancarro. And the lighthouse is not active anymore, but it's still preserved and looked after as a historic place and a day mark for ships and aircraft. So moving into the 20th century now, and life became a bit easier at lighthouses with the introduction of electricity, phones, radio, and then later seaplanes and helicopters. So it meant that lighthouses weren't quite as isolated as they had been. However, there weren't as many female keepers in the 20th century. It was a different era. Most women were keepers' wives and worked alongside their husbands. And I really love this quote from a Sydney newspaper from 1927, which says, "Wifehood takes some women into strange places, but wherever woman goes, she always makes a home, even in the lonely outposts of the deep." So it's quite poetic. Now, as I mentioned, it was rare for women to be keepers, and so instead they had a lot of other different jobs to do, and it involved managing the lighthouse station. So they were cooking, cleaning, looking after children, homeschooling if the lighthouse was remote, which it usually was, managing the books, gardening, farming, and hosting visitors to the station. So a huge amount of work still involved for women, but in a different capacity. And also another rule that was introduced during the 20th century, in some parts of the world at least, was that women had to leave the lighthouse a month or two before they were due to give birth, while the husband stayed. And so she would give birth in a hospital. And in the early days, that involved traveling to hospital on foot, cart, or boat, however she could get there. And then later, helicopters and planes made the journey somewhat faster and easier. And of course, some lighthouses were on quite steep cliffs. So, you know, you had to be on a crane and be hauled up the hill on a trolley to get to the top. So you can just imagine that these arrivals and departures from lighthouses were not straightforward. And some women thrived on the lifestyle at lighthouses and others didn't. And often that depended on how remote the lighthouse was. The more remote, barren the lighthouse, the more challenging the life. But the keeper and his wife were always hired as a couple because living at a lighthouse station involved teamwork and partnership. So it was important that they could both cope. And newspapers often describe these women as lonely lighthouse women, and were quite curious about them because obviously they lived a world apart from most other people, and their stories were not always known. However, through the 20th century, with radio and TV and documentaries, books, and more media, these women's stories started to be captured and emerge, and it gave people a growing understanding of really what the life was like and what was involved. And in this picture on the right, you can see two keepers and their wives in the 1930s on Stevens Island, which is a lighthouse island here in New Zealand. And that animal the keeper is holding is a New Zealand tuatara, so it's a small reptile, and there are tens of thousands of them on the island. One example of a lighthouse keeper's wife telling her story in America was Connie Scoville Small, who was described by President Bush Sr. as the First Lady of Light for her contribution to lighthouses, because she supported her husband, Elson, for 30 years at main lighthouses in the early 20th century. So in the early days, they had no plumbing or electricity at these stations. So the life, you know, would have been challenging, to say the least. And then later, Connie dedicated a lot of her time to lighthouse education and preservation. And she was one of the first women to write a book telling the story of her life at lighthouses. And it really becomes clear when you read the book just how much sacrifice was involved in her part and how crucial that teamwork and partnership were to keep, to sustain the life. And her book was first published in 1986 when she was in her 80s. But there were still a few female lighthouse keepers around the world in the 20th century. And one example is Fanny Salter, who was keeper of Turkey Point Light in the early 20th century. So when her keeper husband died in 1925, and she was in her 40s at the time, she was personally appointed by President Coolidge and ran the lighthouse until 1947, so more than 2 decades. And electricity was not installed until 1943. So at that point, the light could simply be switched on. But before that, obviously, there was a lot more work involved. And she was known as America's last civilian woman keeper of the 20th century because from the late 1930s, lighthouse keepers had to be Coast Guard personnel, and the rules changed. So moving on now to today's keepers and caretakers. And as I said, most lighthouses are now automated, but there are still thousands of people around the world who look after them, both men and women who work hard to preserve and maintain the lights and the land around it. And they do that by, maintaining the light itself, but also keeping the history alive, running tours, fundraising to raise money to keep the lighthouse standing. It's all really important work to keep these stories alive and keep these beautiful towers going. And a few countries, including France and Canada, still have staffed lighthouses. So that means they have dedicated keepers still running the light. And I was really excited to discover that when I was writing my book. So one example of a remote lighthouse with caretakers is on Matsuka Island. So this is a fairly wild island in Tasmania, Australia. It's Australia's southernmost lighthouse, and it looks in the direction of Antarctica. I think Antarctica is the next point of land across the wide Southern Ocean. So as you can see, it's fairly exposed. There's the lighthouse at the top. It was built in the 1890s, and there were keepers living on this island for more than 100 years until the lighthouse became automated. But this island still has caretakers, which means every 6 months, a couple lives here and they look after the island and the lighthouse. And it just sounds incredible. I interviewed one of the women for my book, and she took these photos while she was there. Just beautiful photos of the old lighthouse. So as I mentioned, it's Australia's southernmost lighthouse. On the island, it rains 250 days a year, very, very windy, not the easiest place to live. It's been described as wild, battered and intimidating, but nevertheless, there were families living there for a very long time. And before radio was installed and telephones, they used to use a system called pigeon post, which meant they used carrier pigeons to deliver important messages from the island to Tasmania. And apparently some of those messages arrived. I don't think it was the most foolproof system, but pretty incredible to imagine now, especially while I'm talking to you here over Zoom. And as I mentioned, in Canada, they still have staffed lighthouses. So I believe they have about 50 of them still staffed. One of them is Cape Beale Light Station, which is on Vancouver Island. And I interviewed Karen Zacharuk for my book. She's been the head keeper at this lighthouse for about 10 years. And as you can see from the picture on the left, the station is surrounded by a nature reserve, and inside that are wolves, cougars and bears, which do make sudden appearances at the station, so the keepers have to know how to handle them. Karen has one assistant keeper, so they do rotating shifts, and her duties include monitoring the weather, looking after the station, search and rescue, although not the Ida Lewis search and rescue, more now notifying the Canadian Coast Guard. It's a different system than it used to be. But Karen was very passionate about her job, and she just loved being surrounded by nature, but also being connected to people at the same time. But yeah, it's just incredible that there are still people around the world doing this really important work. And finally, we're almost out of time, I think, but I wanted to quickly talk about the legacy of lighthouses, because people talk about loving lighthouses, and I think most of us do. Most of us feel some sort of connection to them. And that's because, first of all, they're part of history. As we've seen, their history spans thousands of years, from those early bonfires to the staffed lighthouses that we've just seen. And even though many are automated, they're still used as day marks for ships and aircraft. Many of them are painted with unique patterns to make them recognizable. They're huge tourist attractions, which is part of what sustains them. And most of them have stories. Some of them are ghost stories. And so there are often tours you can take of these particular lighthouses, which is fantastic because it not only helps the towers, but it keeps the history alive and helps us remember all these incredible keepers. And lighthouses have also inspired some of the world's greatest art. And I've included a lot of pictures and quotes from poetry in my book, because there's just so many to choose from. And I've just put a few random examples here. There's, Hollywood movies. There's Virginia Woolf's book To the Lighthouse. The staircases, the internal Tower of St. Augustine Lighthouse, which is believed to be one of America's most haunted lighthouses. And of course, the children's classic Lighthouse Keeper's Lunch. But there are so many others. They just continue to inspire us. And they're also international symbols of hope and peace. So I know many of you are in America. I'm here in New Zealand, and there'll be hopefully people listening from different parts of the world. And we all love lighthouses, and they all inspire us. We all know what they do. And of course, all the stories of courage, duty, and dedication. And I think it's really important to remember these stories because these women dedicated so much of their lives to their respective lighthouse. And that concludes my talk. Thank you very much for listening. I'll pass you back to Julie.
Oh, Shona, that was lovely. I highly recommend all of you, if you haven't read the book, it is fascinating, and she is a fellow book lover, and the quotes that she uses and the illustrations and art are fabulous. You can get her book on Amazon and Amazon Smile, and we'd love for you to choose the Mariners Museum as your charity of choice when you order her book. We have a few questions, Shona. Dr. Shona McDonald would love to hear you talk about how you chose the women to feature, as well as the quotes at the beginning of the chapters. I'm sure they weren't easy decisions, Dr. McDonald says.
That's a very good question. I suppose I tried to include a selection of women around the world and different types of stories because, yeah, there were so many to choose from. And some of them were keepers' widows, some of them were daughters, some of them were independent women who simply wanted to experience that life and, have a profession that helped others. And so there were different circumstances. And of course, every lighthouse is different. So just by being at a different lighthouse, you have a different life story. And in terms of the quotes, I suppose I just picked the ones that spoke to me the most personally. There's no shortage of beautiful poems and stories about lighthouses. So I suppose I just read them, and I had to have the tough choice of picking, a dozen that really stood out to me the most and resonated.
Well, you did a great job choosing. Peter, our friend from England, is asking, might you say a few words about Grace Darling? I know she's in the book quite a bit.
She is in the book quite a bit, yeah. Well, Grace Darling's another incredible story. She was a keeper's daughter in England and of Longstone Lighthouse, and she witnessed a shipwreck, the Forfarshire, on some rocks close to the lighthouse. And she and her father rowed out in quite difficult weather to rescue some of the survivors of that shipwreck, and they saved lives and they performed this heroic work. And so Grace suddenly found herself very famous after this event, and she was given medals for bravery and praise and received fan mail. But the sad thing was it was sort of a bit relentless, and it was in the early 1800s at a time when people didn't really know how to handle media attention and an inundation of visitors. And so poor Grace, who was only in her early 20s, was taken by surprise after having lived such an isolated life. And so her health suffered and she died just a few years later. But she's still remembered even today for her bravery. So it's sort of a poignant story.
Thank you. You do talk about Boston Light in the book. Do you talk about Sally Snowman?
I have not talked about Sally Snowman. I have heard her story, and it's great to know that there are still women working at lighthouses in America.
Good. This is a more of a statement, but this gentleman's wife and he have been tour guides and keepers at several lighthouses over the past 20 plus years.
Great.
For you, Shona, Point Furman Lighthouse over the harbors of Long Beach and LA, California. The first two lighthouse keepers that were sisters in 1874 and the last two lighthouse keepers at the start of World War II were also sisters. So a great story, and he thanks you so much for your interest and sharing with us tonight. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's great to know. I love stories of family working together at lighthouses.
Well, and I was fascinated that you didn't know about your great-grandfather until you started the book. So that's incredible connection that makes it even more gratifying.
Yeah.
Pamela says there are several lighthouses in the Hudson River in New York State, north of New York City. She's not sure if any were tended by women, but was wondering if your research took you to the Hudson River.
I do mention a little bit about the Hudson in my book. I didn't come across any female keepers there, but there were certainly families with children at those lighthouses. And conditions sounded quite challenging in the winter, especially with the ice that can form around there.
Mm. Nicole asked, is there a place to get a signed copy of your book? Obviously, if you were with us at the museum, we'd be doing a book signing. But do you sell signed copies from your website, perhaps?
Oh, that's a good question. No, I don't. I usually just sign books when I'm selling them in person.
Right.
And I don't have any copies with me, but I am visiting my publisher next month, so I could possibly sign some then. I don't live in the same town as they do, but yeah, maybe I'll have to follow up on that.
Well, Nicole, if you would like to email the museum, I'll follow up with Shona to see how we could get one of her books to you. You can email lectureseries@marinersmuseum.org, and I'll follow up with your question. I think that's the questions. We had wonderful comments. We had a guest that let us know we didn't know what Eastern Daylight Time or Eastern Standard Time is. So we've learned a lot tonight about lighthouses and timekeeping. And we just thank you so much for sharing this, and I highly just love the book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me as a guest. I really enjoyed it.
Well, it was wonderful, and we hope you'll come visit Virginia when you head to the States next.
I promise I will.
Please do. Our next evening lecture is May 20th, Thursday evening at 7 p.m., whichever Eastern Standard Time is correct. We will be having the host of a public broadcasting television series called Museum Access. It's hosted by Leslie Mueller, and the program will be behind the scenes at America's top museums. And so it's her getting to see things that a lot of us don't see, that don't work in museums. And she will talk about the Mariners Museum as a top museum, which we absolutely are. So I encourage you to register for that. And it's registration's not quite up yet, but it will be in a few days. And I think that is it. And we appreciate all of you being here. And Shona, thank you again. It was lovely. Good night.